Nvidia's RTX 30 series of GPUs will always be remembered for one thing: their lack of stock when they launched. I know that because I waited 2 long years to finally upgrade to one of them, and I haven't even done a proper benchmarking video on my 3080 yet, which ends now, because I've tested it at 1080p, 1440p and 4K to see how this Ampere beast gets on in 2023, and spoiler alert, it gets on pretty well. This RTX 3080 is my personal daily driver. It plays all of the games that I want to play, and more importantly, it's rendered every single video that you watch here on the YouTube channel for the past year, which is probably more important. I bought it for £550 used back in 2022, which I thought was not a bad deal at the time, especially as that was sort of on the tail end of the crypto mining boom, so I thought it wasn't a bad deal. However, in 2023 you can find it for just over £400 on the used market, with some listings even going for less than £400, which I've seen, which is not bad if you need the Nvidia feature set. For the £400 to £450 you shell out, you will get 8704 CUDA cores, 10GB of GDDR6X memory running through a 320-bit memory bus. The Samsung 8nm process also kicks out some heat with a whopping 320W TDP on the RTX 3080, and let me tell you now, this thing is pretty hard to call. The model that I'm using is the Nvidia Founders Edition, and unlike most 3080s, is only a dual slot graphics card, but it does get pretty toasty and pretty loud in a lot of gaming scenarios. So there is that, and it's also a massive pain to take apart because there's just ribbon cables and Torx screws all over the place. But man, is this cooler unique with its weird pass-through design. I think that's what it's called. I'm not sure off the top of my head. But enough of that though, how does the RTX 3080 get on in 2023? To find out, I've put it into my main system, mainly because I didn't want to take it out and put it into the test bench, but that's okay because my main system has an Intel Core i7 13700K, 32GB of DDR5 memory running in dual channel 5600MHz CL36, an MSI Z690 Force Wi-Fi motherboard, and a Samsung 980 Pro NVMe Gen 4 SSD, all of the parts for which are linked in the description below. I've undervolted the core of the RTX 3080 by -75mV, which should help with the heat output, and I've overclocked the memory by 850MHz, which should help with gaming performance as well. All testing has been done at 1080p, 1440p, and 4K without the aid of upscaling like DLSS or FSR. And I've also tested on the latest Nvidia drivers, which the version will be noted down there because I don't know off the top of my head. The first game up for the RTX 3080 today is Cyberpunk 2077. This was recently updated with the Phantom Liberty 2.0 update, which is what is currently running right now, so this is as up to date as it gets. At 1080p, the RTX 3080 got 122 FPS on average with a 1% low of 87 FPS. Yeah, if you wanted to play Cyberpunk at 1080p on a 3080 for some reason, yeah, it's totally playable. Switching up to 1440p sees the average drop to 86 FPS and the 1% low drop to 60 FPS. This is still very playable on the Ultra preset, and if you were to do some tweaking with, let's say, the reflections, you probably could get around 100 FPS on average if you were to really do some tweaking in this game. And then onto 4K, the average drops even lower to just 38 FPS on average and a 1% low of just 26. I don't recommend the Ultra preset at 4K with the RTX 3080. I would recommend doing some tweaking. I'd have to say, and this will probably become a trend with this video, 1440p is definitely the sweet spot here. Enabling ray tracing for Cyberpunk 2077 and setting that to Ultra. At 1080p, the RTX 3080 gets just 60 FPS on average with a 1% low of 49. This cut the average in half from the rasterization performance. At 1440p, the story pretty much stays true here, as on average the 3080 got 40 FPS on average with a 1% low of 28. This is not something that I'd consider playable, especially if you're spending over £400 on a graphics card at 1440p. And 4K is an absolute joke with ray tracing, getting just 15 FPS on average with a 1% low of just 7. Yeah, that's single digits on an RTX 3080. Next up is F1 23, and this is the newest F1 game that there is today, and here I set it to the Ultra preset with no ray tracing. Here at 1080p, the 3080 got 184 FPS on average with a 1% low of 139. Very nice performance at 1080p, that is not too bad at all. Switching up to 1440p, it sees a drop of the average frame rate to 152 and a 1% low of 125. Still, if you've got a 144Hz monitor, this is a very nice performance right here. Switching this up to 4K sees that average drop further down to 101 FPS on average with a 1% low of 86. So the rasterization performance in F1 23 is very nice, and it is certainly playable at all of these resolutions. Turning on ray tracing in F1 23 is not really worth it in my opinion, but I've tested it regardless. At 1080p, this drops the average down by 80 FPS to 104 FPS on average with a 1% low of 85. Switching up to 1440p sees the average drop to 73 FPS and the 1% low is still above 60 at 61. This performance isn't particularly ideal for a racing game, and I wouldn't recommend RT at all in F1 23. And my verdict from that stays the same at 4K, as it will drop down to just 39 FPS on average with a 1% low of 30 FPS. Ray tracing's not really worth it in F1 23. It doesn't really improve the fidelity that much. It's nothing noticeable, at least, especially if you're driving very fast, which you're going to be in an F1 car. So just leave it at rasterization performance in F1 23 because it does perform quite well with it. Next game up is Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, and to try and avoid some CPU bottlenecks, I've set it to the balanced preset here. And at 1080p, the 3080 got 162 FPS on average with a 1% low of 121. This is some great performance at 1080p, and yeah, I don't think you'll be having any problems there. Switching up to 1440p still sees some great performance with 149 FPS on average and a 1% low of 103 FPS. This is still great for a competitive experience if you've got a 144Hz panel. Switching up to 4K sees the average drop to 92 FPS on average with a 1% low of 62. Still very playable in my opinion, but if you've got like an LG OLED that's 120Hz, maybe drop this down to the minimum or basic preset and keep the textures on high, and you'll probably be getting a lot more frame rate right there, so that is something that I'd recommend. Fortnite is up next, and this is a game that I like to test at very low settings, mainly because it's a competitive game and you're going to want as many frames as possible. So here I set it to DirectX 12 with the low preset, but I kept the view distance on high along with the textures. And at 1080p, this netted 385 FPS on average with a 1% low of 239. Great performance at 1080p, maybe slightly CPU bound. Switching up to 1440p sees the average drop to 308 FPS with 199 FPS for the 1% low. Still very good performance. And even at 4K, even though you're probably not playing this game at 4K, you're still going to get 194 FPS on average with a 1% low of 137. This is some absolutely incredible performance out of Fortnite, and it still looks very crisp, especially at the higher resolutions. So if you want to get into some competitive Fortnite, I think the RTX 3080 is going to be enough for you. Forza Horizon 5 is up next, and this racing game from Microsoft from 2021 has been set to the Extreme preset. Probably not a preset I'd recommend playing with, but even so, with the 3080 you're going to be fine, because at 1080p it got 123 FPS on average with 1% low of 104, and switching up to 1440p sees this drop down to 113 FPS with 97 FPS for the 1% low. So there probably was a bit of a CPU bottleneck at 1080p, which has been alleviated somewhat at 1440p. Switching up to 4K sees this drop down to 79 FPS on average with a 1% low of 69 FPS. At 4K, Forza Horizon 5 looks absolutely incredible, and you'll be having a great racing experience. Maybe drop it down to the Ultra preset and you'll get more frames, which you might enjoy at the high resolutions. Next up is Starfield, and this is the newest game on the list today, and it's probably the hardest to run. That is because at 1080p with the hardware unboxed optimized preset with no FSR2, the 3080 got 94 FPS on average with a 1% low of 80 FPS, which is not too bad. And at 1440p this drops down to 75 FPS on average with 64 FPS for the 1% low, and Finally, moving to 4K, this drops down to below 60 FPS, getting 50 FPS on average with 37 for the 1% low. Both Nvidia and Bethesda have got some work to do to improve the performance of Starfield on Nvidia graphics cards, and I do believe DLSS is officially coming to the game at some point. It is on their list of things to do, so that might be something to look out for as well, but Starfield is playable on the 3080. Doom Eternal is a slightly older game, but it is a very pretty game at that, and setting it to the Ultra Nightmare preset here with no ray tracing and at 1080p, the 3080 got 349 FPS on average with a 1% low of 248. Switching this up to 1440p sees that average drop to 287 FPS with a 1% low of 203. And then at 4K it's still above 144 FPS, getting 169 FPS on average with a 1% low of 136. So if you've got an LG OLED which is 120Hz, Doom Eternal is going to be very playable, absolutely maxed out on rasterization. There's going to be no performance problems here at all with the 3080. Enabling ray tracing in Doom Eternal doesn't impact the frame rate as much as it does in games like Cyberpunk and F123. This is because at 1080p it drops the average down to 240 FPS and the 1% low does drop down ever so slightly to 186. At 1440p this average goes down to 184 and the 1% low goes down to 144. Still very playable if you've got a 165 or a 144Hz monitor. That performance is not too bad there either. And then finally at 4K, we finally get above 60 FPS in a ray tracing game. That is because with ray tracing enabled in Doom Eternal, the 3080 got 93 FPS on average with 77 FPS for the 1% low. So it's a full house in Doom Eternal. It plays very well, and even at 4K, if you wanted to enable DLSS on quality, you'd get a few more frames there as well, and the game would be smoother for basically zero quality loss. Last game up today is Horizon Zero Dawn, and this is a pretty VRAM intensive game, so I wanted to see how bad it would have been at 4K with the 10GB 3080. But starting off with 1080p, it got 177 FPS on average with 119 FPS for the 1% low. And then 1440p sees this average drop down to 147 with a 1% low of 101. And then 4K does see the frame rate drop quite a bit with the average going down to 86 FPS on average with a 1% low of 71. But in all fairness, Horizon Zero Dawn isn't a competitive shooter. 86 frames in this game at 4K is totally fine in my opinion. So from the data that I've gathered today, I can conclude the following. The RTX 3080 is still stupidly powerful for 1080p gaming, with most of the games tested today getting north of 160 FPS. And these were story games too, where fidelity matters more, like Horizon Zero Dawn. I would rather take 1440p or 4K any day and take the FPS drop in games like Horizon Zero Dawn, because the frame rate doesn't really matter. As long as I'm getting at least 90 or 100 in games like that, I don't really care. Every game tested at 1440p got at least 60 FPS, which is great to see as 1440p is a very popular resolution. And even if you want to play competitive games like Fortnite and Rainbow Six Siege, 1440p is a totally doable resolution for an RTX 3080. I can't believe I'm really saying that, to be honest, because this graphics card is still a beast. 4K is still very doable on this card as well, with most rasterized games getting above 60 FPS on average, and even the ones where you do actually get below 60 FPS, you always have the aid of DLSS, and in games where it's absent, AMD's FSR. I do recommend using DLSS when you've got it available, which you do on an RTX 3080, because it is the superior upscaling method. And if you enable DLSS at 1440p and 4K, you won't notice any quality loss at all in most games out there, unless if you pixel peeping, so it's basically free performance. And if DLSS or FSR aren't available, you can always just lower the preset down from ultra to high. I'd rather take the quality of 4K and the extra frame rate over the ultra preset, because the ultra preset in a lot of games isn't necessarily the best preset. In terms of graphical quality, yes, but in terms of performance and sort of performance value, I guess, Ultra isn't the best. The only reason I've tested out Ultra today is just to see what this graphics card can do when it's absolutely maxed out. Ray tracing is also a bit of a mixed bag with the RTX 3080 as well. I would definitely recommend using upscaling technologies here. If a game's got ray tracing, it's more than likely going to have DLSS in it, so I would at least enable DLSS at quality if you're playing with ray tracing at 1440p and 4K. And I'd only recommend ray tracing if you've got the performance to spare. So say if you're getting like 120 frames in Cyberpunk, it might be worth enabling ray tracing to get some extra fidelity right there, but if you're going to be dropping down to below 60 FPS, I don't think ray tracing is worth the performance hit, in my opinion, but it's definitely capable of ray tracing as long as you tweak your settings a bit. At 1080p and 1440p, it's pretty much a no compromise gaming experience playing on this graphics card. You will have to make some sacrifices at 4K, but that's okay. This isn't an RTX 4090, and you only paid around £400 for this graphics card if you're buying it used today, which I think, this is a very good deal. Do bear in mind though, I would recommend the 12GB model for 4K gaming, as it does have the extra 2GB of VRAM, which will help out at higher resolutions in newer games. A lot of the games that we tested today were seeing 9.5GB of usage, which the game was calling for, so I think it will become a problem in newer games which are very VRAM hungry. I love my RTX 3080 and I don't see myself upgrading it anytime soon. It literally does everything I need it to do and more. To be honest, I probably don't need this power because the most intensive games that I really play is probably Starfield at the minute, and that's just down to driver optimizations on Nvidia's side and a bit of game optimization on Bethesda's side. I do mainly play older games though, other than Starfield, and the RTX 3080 is totally overkill for these. Also, with my video editing, even though it's got 12GB of frame buffer, it's never been a problem working with Sony 4K footage, so that's another thing right there as well. I don't need to upgrade it for this. The only thing I don't really like about it is the power consumption, and the Founders Edition does get quite hot and it does run quite loud in some gaming sessions, which is a bit annoying, but I think that's a bit down to my case's airflow as well. It's not particularly brilliant, so that is another thing to note right there. Also, the 10GB of VRAM could be a bit of a problem if I wanted to play at 4K, like if I wanted to hook it up to my LG OLED. It could become a bit of a problem in some games, but to be honest, I'm not really that concerned with it. So if you want to watch some more GPU benchmarks, make sure you check out these two videos right here. They might be right up your alley. And if you stuck around this long, I want to thank you and maybe even ask you for a like if you like the video, and maybe subscribe if you want to watch more tech content. So with that being said, I'm going to catch you in the next one.